Stop right there. First class is for our elite members and you need to go back to the economy queue where you belong. The voice sliced through the low hum of boarding chatter, crisp, authoritative and loud enough for half the cabin to hear. Passengers turned their heads toward the sound, curiosity, confusion, and discomfort flickering across their faces as the flight attendant, her posture rigid and chin lifted, pointed toward the couple standing calmly at the entrance of the first-class cabin. Eleanor Whitmore, a poised woman in her mid-70s whose grace filled a room before her voice did, stood still, her hand resting gently on her husband's arm. Her silver hair framed her calm expression, not a twitch of surprise visible, though the sharpness in her eyes betrayed an understanding too deep for words. Beside her stood Dr. Charles Whitmore, 76, his presence dignified and steady, the kind of man whose silence carried more weight than most people's speeches. They both said nothing. Not yet. Samantha Reed, 29, was not a cruel person by nature. Ambitious and disciplined, she had clawed her way into a prestigious airline role through long hours and relentless self-control. But in that moment her judgment faltered. The sight of an elderly black couple dressed in understated elegance didn't match the image she expected in first class, the image she'd been conditioned to imagine. Polished executives, sleek designers, the casually rich. She mistook quiet dignity for trespass. "I'm sorry," she added, her tone softening only slightly, though her words still cut. "First-class boarding is exclusive. I'll have to ask you to step aside until we finish boarding our premium passengers." Charles met her eyes. "Come. Steady. No anger, no pleading, just quiet authority." "We're exactly where we need to be," he said evenly. The subtle hush that followed seemed to thicken the air. A few passengers averted their gaze, pretending not to listen. Others stared openly. One young man in the nearby aisle seat shifted uncomfortably, his brows drawn tight, clearly uneasy but unsure how to react. Samantha frowned, clutching her tablet. "Sir, I understand, but—" "You understand?" Eleanor's voice came, gentle yet edged with precision. "My dear, I don't believe you do." That tone, elegant, unhurried, certain, made Samantha's confidence wobble. But she pressed on. "Ma'am, these seats are reserved for our VIP clients and elite members. If you'll please step back, I can direct you to the correct cabin." Charles turned his gaze toward the gold-plated plaque above the first-class section door. "Elite members," he repeated softly as if tasting the words. Then he smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, I know the type." Someone in row 2 let out a quiet chuckle, nervous, disbelieving. A woman whispered something to her partner, who shushed her quickly. The energy in the cabin was electric now, tension wrapped in silence. What would you do in this moment? Would you speak up or would you sit back pretending not to notice? Comment below if you believe in equal treatment for everyone. Hit subscribe if you believe racism should never be excused. Samantha gestured again, her patience slipping. "Sir, ma'am, you're holding up the line. I don't want to have to call security before takeoff." Eleanor's posture remained unbroken, her voice still smooth as silk. "You wouldn't want to do that," she said, her words careful, calm. "It wouldn't reflect well on your airline." Something about the way she said your airline made Samantha pause. The phrasing was peculiar, almost ironic. But the growing line behind them snapped her back. "Ma'am, please," she said firmly. "Let's not make this difficult." Charles turned slightly toward his wife, whispering softly enough that only she could hear. "It seems patience is the rarest luxury in the air these days." Eleanor smiled faintly. "Let's not ruin her lesson before it begins," she murmured. A few seats away, the young man who'd been watching, an economy passenger upgraded by luck and miles, felt a twist of unease in his chest. He'd seen this before. The tone, the assumptions, the small public humiliations masked as procedure. He opened his mouth, then closed it again. He wasn't sure if speaking up would help or just make things worse. Meanwhile, Samantha's supervisor, a middle-aged man named Frank, appeared from the galley, sensing the tension. "Is there a problem here, Reed?" he asked, his eyes darting between them. "Yes, sir," she replied quickly. "These passengers seem to have mistaken their seats. They're trying to enter first class without clearance." Frank turned toward the couple. His voice was more cautious now but still authoritative. "May I see your boarding passes, please?" Eleanor handed hers over without a word, the motion slow, deliberate. The ticket gleamed under the cabin lights. Embossed in gold, marked Lifetime Executive Premier. Frank's brow furrowed. He scanned it once, then twice. His voice faltered. "Ah, I see. That's quite unusual." Samantha frowned. "Unusual?" There, she stopped when she saw Frank's expression shift from skepticism to pale realization. Charles adjusted his cufflinks, his composure unshaken. "Is there a problem, young man?" he asked evenly. Frank swallowed hard. "No, sir. Not at all." He turned to Samantha, his voice lower. "You should have checked before assuming." Whispers rippled through the cabin. The passengers who had looked away now watched openly, shame and discomfort written across several faces. Samantha's cheeks burned, her confidence unraveling as her mind struggled to reconcile what she'd just seen. But she wasn't done yet. Pride, the stubborn, blinding kind, made her push once more. "Sir, with all due respect, these passes are from an old tier. We recently restructured our membership system. It's possible they're outdated." Frank stiffened. "Samantha." "It's fine," Charles interrupted gently, his tone oddly final. He took a slow breath, looking directly into her eyes. "If it's outdated, perhaps I should have a word with corporate." The way he said corporate made something cold crawl down her spine. His calm didn't read as defensiveness, it read as power restrained. Authority disguised. The man didn't need to prove anything, and that somehow terrified her. The young man in row 2 finally spoke, his voice tentative but clear. "Excuse me," he said, "but maybe you should double-check before saying something you'll regret." Samantha turned sharply, glaring. "Sir, please mind your own." "Enough." Frank's voice cut through. "That's enough." Charles looked at his wife, who smiled gently, as though everything was unfolding exactly as it should. "Shall we take our seats, dear?" she asked. "Yes," he replied softly. "Let's not delay the flight." They moved gracefully down the aisle, taking their seats in the front row, the true first-class section with the wide reclining seats and golden trim. The cabin grew silent, heavy with collective guilt. Samantha stood frozen, her face pale, eyes wide. Frank leaned toward her, whispering something harsh under his breath. She nodded slowly, mortified. The young man who had spoken up looked after the couple, admiration flickering in his expression. Something about them, their calm, their poise, commanded respect beyond explanation. He didn't know who they were yet, but he could feel it. This wasn't over. In the quiet that followed, Eleanor looked out the window, her reflection soft against the clouds. "Sometimes," she said quietly to her husband, "the world needs to be reminded who truly built the wings they fly on." Charles smiled faintly. "And sometimes," he replied, "it learns the hard way." Frank's voice crackled over the intercom a few minutes later, shakily professional. "Cabin crew, prepare for takeoff." But the energy in the cabin hadn't reset. No amount of procedural tone could erase the echo of what had just unfolded. Eyes still darted toward the Whitmores. Some passengers avoided looking at them altogether, afraid of being caught staring. Others seemed quietly ashamed, whispering to each other about how gracefully the couple had handled the humiliation. Eleanor adjusted her seatbelt, every movement elegant and deliberate. There was no tremor, no outward sign of anger. But her heart beat heavier than usual. She had seen enough in her lifetime to recognize the familiar ache of being underestimated. It was a wound that no age, status, or title could completely erase. Charles, beside her, exhaled softly. "Let it pass," he murmured. Eleanor turned her head toward him, her silver hair catching the light. "Do you still believe in letting it pass after all these years?" He smiled faintly. "I believe in letting people reveal themselves. The truth has its own gravity. It pulls the foolish down without our help." Behind them, Samantha fumbled through her duties. She was still rattled, every announcement stiff, every motion mechanical. Her usual precision was replaced by self-consciousness. Each time she walked down the aisle, she felt the weight of passengers' eyes on her, Some judgmental, others curious, a few sympathetic. Frank had said nothing since his quiet reprimand. But his silence carried more threat than any shouted warning. Samantha knew she had crossed a line, even if she didn't fully understand how deep it ran. As the plane lifted through the clouds, Eleanor's gaze drifted to the endless blue beyond the window. For a moment, she let herself feel the heaviness of the encounter. But only for a moment. The rest she folded neatly like a letter she would never send. Halfway through the flight, service began. Samantha approached the first-class cabin again, holding a tray of drinks. Her hand trembled slightly as she neared the Whitmores. "Would you care for some champagne?" she asked, her tone careful, stripped of its earlier edge. Charles looked up at her, eyes steady, voice calm. "Thank you. But we'll pass for now." Eleanor added softly, "Perhaps some tea later, dear." "Yes, ma'am," Samantha replied, nodding quickly. She turned to leave, but Eleanor's voice stopped her. "Young lady," she said, her tone neither sharp nor indulgent, simply true. "Do you know who you represent when you wear that uniform?" Samantha froze, unsure how to answer. I represent the airline, ma'am." Eleanor's eyes held hers. "Then you represent more than a logo. You represent every value printed in the fine lines of its founding: dignity, respect, equality. That uniform carries history. You wear someone's dream. Never forget that." Samantha nodded, flustered. "Yes, ma'am. You're right." She turned away too quickly, almost spilling the champagne. A passenger a few rows back leaned toward his companion. "She's giving her a lesson without raising her voice," he whispered. "That's power." Indeed it was. True power never needed to shout. A little later, the young man from before, the one who had spoken up, found a moment to approach. "Excuse me, sir," he said quietly, leaning beside their seats. "I just wanted to say, that shouldn't have happened." "I'm sorry." Charles looked up, his eyes kind. "You did the right thing. You spoke. That's more than most." The man smiled awkwardly. "I just couldn't sit there." Eleanor nodded approvingly. The world changes because of people who refuse silence. He returned to his seat, visibly moved. He didn't yet know whose company he had just shared words with, but he could feel the gravity of their presence, something extraordinary masked in simplicity. As the flight continued, Samantha disappeared to the back where Frank waited, arms crossed. His expression was unreadable. "She's someone important, isn't she?" Samantha whispered. "That woman, she spoke like she." Frank sighed. "More than important." Samantha frowned. "What do you mean?" He looked her dead in the eye. "Dr. Charles Whitmore founded this airline. Eleanor Whitmore was its CEO for 15 years. The reason we even have a first-class elite program is because of them. You just told the owners of this company to go back to economy." Her stomach dropped. The color drained from her face. "No," she breathed. Frank nodded slowly. "Yes. And if I were you, I'd start thinking about how to apologize properly before this plane lands." Samantha leaned against the galley wall, dizzy. The hum of the engines seemed louder, sharper, pressing in on her. She thought of her earlier tone, her assumptions, her certainty, all of it unraveling now into something raw and humiliating. Up front, Eleanor rested her head lightly against the seat. Charles glanced at her, a quiet smile ghosting his lips. "You always were kinder than I am," he said softly. She chuckled faintly. "Someone has to balance you, Charles." When Samantha returned to serve tea, she moved slower this time. Her voice was small. "Ma'am, sir, I owe you both an apology. I was wrong." Charles studied her face for a long moment. "You were?" he said simply. Then softer, "But the measure of a person isn't in their mistakes. It's in what they learn from them." Eleanor added gently, "Understanding begins where assumption ends." Tears welled faintly in Samantha's eyes. "I'm truly sorry." Eleanor smiled, warm, forgiving yet firm. "Then let that apology mean something when you see the next person who doesn't fit your expectations." Samantha nodded, barely holding her composure. "Yes, ma'am. I will." The young man in row 2 caught the exchange. He could sense a shift, something bigger than embarrassment, something cleansing. The cabin, which had felt tense and divided, now held a stillness that bordered on reverence. But this was only the calm before revelation. As the flight neared its destination, an announcement crackled overhead. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to extend a warm welcome to our company's founders, Dr. Charles and Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, traveling with us today. It's an honor to have them aboard." Every head turned. Gasps spread through the cabin like sparks. Samantha froze mid-step, tray in hand. Her mouth fell open. Passengers who had whispered, judged, or stayed silent now sat up straighter, guilt visible in every posture. The Whitmores didn't gloat. They didn't even look around. Charles simply folded his hands, eyes closed briefly, as if offering a silent prayer for the lesson life had just written. Eleanor leaned toward her husband and whispered, "Do you think they understand now?" He replied quietly, "Only if they choose to remember." The plane began its descent, gliding through the clouds toward a new beginning, not just for Samantha, but for everyone who had witnessed the truth unfold. The young man's mind echoed with the image of the couple's calm faces, their grace under fire, their refusal to fight ugliness with rage. He knew he would remember it forever. What would you do in that moment? Would you speak truth even when silence feels safer? Comment below if you believe in equality that doesn't depend on appearances. Hit subscribe if you believe every person deserves respect. In every seat, on every flight, in every walk of life. The landing gear lowered with a subtle thud, and the cabin trembled softly as the plane began its descent. Outside, the sky was awash with the amber glow of early evening, light bending through clouds like forgiveness made visible. Inside, the air was heavy with unspoken reckoning. Samantha's heart raced as she went through the motions. The closing announcements, the seatbelt checks, the polite smiles that no longer felt natural. Her uniform, once a symbol of pride, now felt like a weight. Every glance from the passengers seemed to pierce through her composure, reminding her of her earlier arrogance. Eleanor sat quietly, her hands folded neatly in her lap. There was no trace of bitterness on her face. Instead, there was something deeper, reflection. She had endured moments like this before, in boardrooms, on streets, in whispers disguised as compliments. But this one was different. This one felt like a full-circle moment. A public display of quiet resistance met by truth, revealed in its time. Charles glanced sideways at his wife. "You're thinking again?" he said softly. She smiled faintly. "You know me too well." "I know that look," he murmured. "You're not angry." "No," she said. "I'm tired. But there's peace in this kind of tired." He nodded, understanding completely. When the plane touched down, the passengers erupted into the usual shuffle of movements. Seatbelts unclicking, overhead bins creaking, the hum of impatience to leave. But no one spoke loudly. It was as though the entire cabin carried a collective awareness that something significant had happened during that flight, something that demanded quiet respect. As the plane taxied toward the gate, Frank approached the Whitmores with cautious reverence. "Dr. and Mrs. Whitmore," he began, his tone measured, "on behalf of the crew and the company, I want to personally apologize for what happened earlier. It was unacceptable." Charles regarded him calmly. "Thank you, Frank. But we're not here for apologies. We're here for awareness." Frank nodded. "Understood, sir. Still, I take full responsibility. And I'll make sure it's addressed properly." Eleanor looked up at him kindly. "The measure of leadership isn't in punishment, but in correction. Handle it with grace." "Yes, ma'am," he said softly. Samantha stood a few feet behind him, unable to meet their eyes. When Eleanor turned toward her, Samantha's throat tightened. "I'll make this right," she whispered, voice barely audible. "You already have the chance to," Eleanor replied gently. "Just don't waste it." Passengers began filing out, but many paused briefly beside the Whitmore seats. Some offered nods of respect, others quiet apologies with their eyes. The young man who had spoken up earlier stopped once more. "Dr. Whitmore," he said softly, "you don't know me, but I want to thank you. You handled everything with more grace than I could have." Charles smiled. "Grace isn't weakness. It's the strongest form of discipline there is." The man grinned faintly. "I think I needed to hear that today." As he walked away, Eleanor turned to her husband. He'll remember. Yes, Charles said. They all will. When the jet bridge connected, Frank escorted the Whitmores personally toward the exit. Samantha followed a few steps behind, every movement small and tentative. The walk felt endless, the hum of the terminal growing louder with each step, mingling with the echo of guilt that wouldn't fade. As they neared the gate, a small group of corporate representatives stood waiting. One of them, a tall man in a navy suit, rushed forward, extending his hand. Dr. Whitmore. Mrs. Whitmore. We didn't know you were traveling today. It's an honor to have you both aboard. Charles shook his hand politely. We prefer to see how things operate when no one knows we're watching. The man froze for a fraction of a second, realizing the implication. I see, he said nervously. I trust your experience was satisfactory? Charles glanced toward Samantha, then back at him. Enlightening. The corporate representative swallowed. I'll make sure we follow up personally on your observations. Good, Eleanor said softly. Because this wasn't just about us. It was about what your company represents, and what it still needs to learn. As they stepped out into the terminal, a few passengers who had witnessed everything gathered near the windows, watching silently as the couple walked away. They moved slowly, gracefully, like a story unfolding step by step, one that carried a moral larger than the moment itself. Outside the gate, a car awaited. A driver hurried forward, opening the door. Eleanor paused before getting in, turning once more toward the glass wall where Samantha still stood inside, frozen by the gate's threshold. Their eyes met through the reflection. No words. No gestures. Just understanding, the kind that burns quietly, reshaping the soul. Then the Whitmores were gone. Samantha stayed behind as the terminal emptied. Her supervisor approached cautiously. Go home, he said. You've had a long day. She nodded numbly. I just need a minute. When she finally walked toward the staff corridor, she stopped near a poster on the wall, one she had never paid much attention to before. It bore the airline's founding quote, written in elegant silver letters. Asterisk, every seat on our planes carries a dream. Treat them all with respect, for one day it might be yours. Asterisk. Dr. Charles Whitmore, 1978. Samantha stared at it for a long moment, her reflection caught in the glass. The weight of realization settled deep. She thought about every face she had misjudged, every silent assumption she had made, and every moment she had chosen authority over empathy. That night she couldn't sleep. The words replayed in her mind like a refrain. You represent more than a logo. She promised herself she would never forget it. Meanwhile, in their quiet home on the outskirts of the city, the Whitmores sat together on their porch, watching the horizon fade into twilight. The world was different now, faster, louder, more divided. But some lessons they believed were timeless. Eleanor broke the silence first. Do you think she'll learn? Charles nodded slowly. Everyone learns eventually. The question is whether they change. She smiled. You've always had more faith than I do. I've just seen enough to know, he said, that every moment of injustice holds a seed of transformation. They fell into silence again, the kind that only comes between two people who have built empires together, fallen, risen, and still believe in goodness despite it all. What would you do in this moment? Would you have stayed silent or spoken up? Would you have judged or waited to understand? Comment below if you believe in the power of respect, the kind that doesn't check status, color, or wealth. Hit subscribe if you believe dignity should be universal, and equality should never have to ask permission to board first class. Morning light broke through the tall windows of the Whitmore estate, painting soft golden streaks across the marble floor. The silence of the house was peaceful, filled with the comfort of familiarity, a home built not from luxury but from purpose. Every corner held a story, every framed photograph a legacy of perseverance. Eleanor sat by the breakfast table, stirring her tea thoughtfully. Across from her, Charles read the morning paper, his glasses perched low on his nose. He wasn't reading for news, he was reading for the pulse of the world, for how it responded. She smiled faintly. You're looking for it, aren't you? He didn't glance up. It'll be there. Somewhere near the bottom of the page where the quiet stories live. He was right. A small article, tucked beside a headline about the economy read, "Founders of Global Air Witness Incident Highlighting Need for Diversity Reform." Charles sighed. They turned it into a press statement. Eleanor leaned forward, scanning the paragraph. At least they didn't bury it entirely. "Publicity," he said flatly. "They'll issue an apology, hold a meeting, maybe schedule another diversity workshop no one takes seriously. Then they'll forget. Unless," Eleanor added, "we don't let them." He looked up then, the faint spark of purpose reigniting behind his calm demeanor. "You have something in mind." She smiled, the kind of smile that meant plans were already forming. "I want to visit the training center. Not as Eleanor Whitmore, former CEO, but as a woman who once sat where that young attendant stood." He folded the newspaper. "You'd go back." "I'd remind them what this company was built on," she said simply. "Humanity, Charles. We've let it become numbers and quotas. It's time to bring back the reason we started." He nodded, slowly, approvingly. "Then we'll go together." Meanwhile, across the city, Samantha sat in her small apartment, the uniform from yesterday folded neatly on the bed, a silent witness to her sleepless night. She had read the same article that morning. Her stomach twisted with shame as her eyes traced the words. Her name wasn't mentioned. The company had protected her identity, but she knew who she was in that story. The phone buzzed. A message from Frank. "Meeting at HQ tomorrow morning. Mandatory. Founders attending." Her pulse quickened. She didn't know whether to feel fear or gratitude. Maybe both. The next morning, the airline's corporate headquarters buzzed with anticipation. Employees filled the glass-walled conference hall, whispering in low tones. It wasn't every day that the Whitmores, the legends behind the entire brand, walked through those doors. When they entered, the room fell silent. Charles, dressed in a deep gray suit, carried himself with the unforced authority of a man who built an empire but never needed to flaunt it. Eleanor, elegant in cream, stood beside him like calm justice personified. Every step they took commanded quiet respect. Samantha was there too, seated near the back. Her palms were damp, her heartbeat loud in her ears. She didn't expect them to notice her, not among the dozens of staff, executives, and trainees assembled, but her eyes couldn't leave them. The company's current CEO, a nervous man in his 50s, began the session with forced enthusiasm. "It's an honor to have Dr. and Mrs. Whitmore here today to speak on the values that shaped global air." Charles raised a hand gently, cutting him off. "Thank you, but let's skip the introductions. We're not here for ceremony." The CEO nodded, stepping aside quickly. Charles turned to the audience. His voice was calm, deliberate, the kind that didn't need volume to command attention. 50 years ago we started this airline with one idea, that travel could be the great equalizer. The sky doesn't care who you are, what you look like, or where you come from. Everyone deserves to rise. He let the words hang, unhurried. But somewhere along the way we lost that. We turned service into procedure, respect into policy, and humanity into fine print. Eleanor stepped forward, her tone steady, clear. "Yesterday I was reminded of that loss. I met a young woman who forgot what her uniform stands for. But I also met passengers who remembered, who spoke up when silence felt safer." A ripple of quiet emotion spread through the room. Eleanor's gaze swept across the faces before her. "We cannot fix what we refuse to confront. Every one of you here represents the face of this company. Every word you speak to a passenger carries weight. The person you look down on might be the one who built the wings you're standing on." Samantha's eyes filled, her throat tight. Every word pierced through her. Eleanor continued. "The solution isn't shame. It's awareness, growth, accountability. If we teach our people empathy before efficiency, we'll never have another incident like yesterday's." Charles turned slightly toward his wife, his voice softer now. "And if anyone here believes they're above learning, they've already failed the mission." The silence was profound. Then, unexpectedly, Eleanor looked directly at Samantha. Their eyes met across the room. "Would you stand, please?" Samantha's breath caught. Every head turned toward her. Slowly she rose, trembling slightly. Eleanor's tone remained calm. You were that young woman yesterday. Correct. Yes, ma'am, Samantha said quietly. I was. And what have you learned since then? Samantha swallowed hard. That assumption blinds judgment. That kindness costs nothing. And that humility, she hesitated, her voice cracking. Humility is the difference between serving and truly caring. A murmur of agreement rippled through the hall. Eleanor nodded. Then you've learned something most people never do. Don't let that lesson fade when the world stops watching. Samantha's tears fell freely now. I won't. I promise. Charles stepped forward slightly. Remember this day. Because this, not titles, not paychecks, is where real leadership begins. The room broke into quiet applause, not for spectacle, but for understanding. As the session ended, Charles and Eleanor began to leave, surrounded by staff eager to thank them. Samantha stood frozen, overwhelmed. When Eleanor reached her, she paused. Walk with us, she said simply. Outside, beneath the towering glass of the corporate lobby, the air was crisp and light. The three of them stood there for a moment, the past, the mistake, and the lesson, sharing a silence that felt like reconciliation. Eleanor turned to Samantha. You'll have another chance. Not to prove yourself to us, but to the next person who stands where we once stood. Samantha nodded through her tears. Thank you. Charles smiled faintly. You don't thank us by words. You thank us by action. As they departed, the morning sun caught the airline's logo gleaming above the entrance, two wings rising in perfect symmetry. It looked almost like forgiveness taking flight. What would you do in this moment? Would you defend what's right even if you're afraid? Comment below if you believe every mistake can lead to change. Hit subscribe if you believe that dignity should never depend on perception. It should be the starting point for everyone. The following week brought ripples across the entire airline industry. News outlets, blogs, and social media channels buzzed with conversation about the incident and its aftermath. What began as a moment of quiet humiliation had transformed into a movement of reflection, one sparked not by outrage but by grace. Inside Global Air headquarters, a new initiative was underway, the Whitmore Equality Program. Training modules were being rewritten, new leadership sessions introduced, and for the first time, staff were encouraged to speak about the silent biases they carried. Every employee, from pilot to porter, was being reminded of the same principle. Every person is a passenger of value. But behind the formalities, the story still lived in hearts, especially in one. Samantha sat at her kitchen table that Friday morning, her uniform neatly pressed beside a small notepad. She'd started writing again, not policies or checklists but thoughts. Regret. Growth. Hope. On the top of the page she had written a single sentence. Humility is the highest altitude. Each day since the meeting she had taken a small action, helping a nervous traveler, offering patience to a complaining customer, noticing faces she might have once overlooked. She was learning that redemption wasn't an apology given once. It was a choice made every day after. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was from corporate relations. Mrs. Whitmore has requested your assistance on a training visit this afternoon. Her breath caught. She reread the message twice, unsure if it was real. The same woman whose grace had exposed her mistake now wanted her help? That afternoon, Samantha found herself standing at the entrance of the training academy, a sleek, modern building humming with quiet purpose. She adjusted her jacket nervously, palms clammy. Then through the glass doors she saw Eleanor approaching. Eleanor's stride was measured, elegant, the kind of presence that filled a room without speaking. She smiled as she saw Samantha. You came. Yes, ma'am, Samantha said softly. Thank you for letting me. Thank yourself, Eleanor replied. Growth requires courage. Most people run from it. They walked together through the hallways, passing young recruits in crisp uniforms. Many of them whispered when they saw Eleanor, the woman who had founded their legacy. Eleanor paused beside a classroom window. Do you see them? She asked. Samantha nodded. They remind me of myself on my first day. Excited. A little scared. Eleanor's gaze softened. Then teach them what fear shouldn't do. It should never make you smaller than your heart. When they entered the room, the trainees immediately stood, eyes wide. Eleanor gestured for them to sit. "This young woman," she began, resting a hand lightly on Samantha's shoulder, "knows something about humility and strength. Today she'll help me teach you both." Samantha froze. "Me?" Eleanor nodded. "Yes. Because lessons only matter when they come from lived truth." So she spoke. She told them about the flight, not with dramatics, not as a confession, but as a story of learning. She spoke about judgment, about the small ways bias hides behind professionalism, and about how one act of prejudice can erase years of good work in a moment. Her voice trembled at first, but soon steadied as she saw the trainees listening, truly listening. "I thought authority meant control," she said. "But I learned it means responsibility. The power to lift someone's dignity or to crush it, that's the real choice every day in this job." Eleanor stood beside her silently, pride in her eyes. When Samantha finished, the room fell into thoughtful silence. A young trainee finally raised his hand. "How did you find the courage to face them again?" Samantha smiled faintly. "Because they didn't destroy me. They showed me how to rebuild." The trainees nodded, some even teary-eyed. It was more than a training session. It was a mirror held up to their own humanity. After the class, Eleanor and Samantha stepped out into the garden courtyard. The air was fresh, the world washed clean by a light drizzle that had passed moments before. Eleanor stopped near a bench, sitting with slow grace. "You did well," she said. Samantha sat beside her, emotion catching in her throat. "I don't know how to thank you." "You already have," Eleanor said gently. "By learning. By showing up. That's how change begins, one person, one action at a time." Samantha hesitated. "Mrs. Whitmore, can I ask something?" "Of course." "Why were you so kind to me after everything I said? After how I treated you?" Eleanor looked out at the horizon, her voice quiet but steady. "Because anger only teaches fear. But forgiveness teaches reflection. And reflection, that's what changes people." Samantha swallowed hard, tears stinging her eyes. "You changed me." Eleanor smiled. "Then let that be your legacy. Change others." The moment hung between them, simple yet profound. That evening, as the sun dipped low, Eleanor returned home. Charles was on the porch again, sipping tea, the paper folded beside him. He looked up as she approached. "How was she?" he asked. "Willing," Eleanor said. "And humbled. The best kind of combination." He smiled knowingly. "You always were good at turning pain into purpose." She sat beside him, the sound of evening crickets rising softly in the background. "We can't change the world overnight," she said. "But maybe we can teach it to pause, just long enough to think before it judges." He nodded slowly. "That's how revolutions begin. Not in shouting, in reflection." They sat together in peaceful silence, two souls bound by legacy and time. The house around them seemed to breathe with quiet gratitude. The next morning, Global Air's internal newsletter went live. The headline read, "From Lesson to Legacy, the Whitmore Way Returns." And below it, a photograph, Eleanor and Samantha standing together before a room of new recruits, smiling. What would you do if given a second chance to do right? Would you hide from your mistake, or use it to build something better? Comment below if you believe forgiveness can change more than punishment ever could. Hit subscribe if you believe justice and compassion belong on the same flight path. A month later, the hum of transformation could be felt across every corridor of Global Air. It wasn't loud or forced, it was quiet, steady, and real. Conversations were different now. People paused before they spoke. Crew members began to greet passengers with more sincerity, and managers started listening more than they ordered. Something had shifted and everyone could feel it. The Whitmore Equality Program was no longer just a headline, it had become the heartbeat of the company. Training sessions expanded worldwide, incorporating real stories of bias, compassion, and redemption. Employees shared experiences they had once buried in silence. The change wasn't about damage control anymore. It was about rebuilding culture from the inside out. In a corner office overlooking the city skyline, Charles stood gazing out the window. He had always loved the sight of airplanes taking off, thousands of lives rising into the open blue, each carrying its own story. Behind him, Eleanor was finishing a meeting with the executive board. Her voice, calm but commanding, carried across the room. "We built this company on more than steel and schedules," she said. "We built it on trust. And trust requires more than apologies, it demands consistency. Let's make sure this new chapter isn't a reaction. Let it be a standard." The board members nodded, humbled. When the meeting ended, she joined Charles by the window. "Do you think it's working?" she asked. He smiled faintly. "I think the world is finally remembering what we meant when we said everyone deserves to rise." She placed her hand gently on his. "Sometimes I wonder if we were meant to retire at all." He chuckled softly. "You? Retire? I've known hurricanes with less persistence." Eleanor laughed, the sound warm and free. "You always did know how to make philosophy sound like flattery." Later that afternoon, they attended a ceremony at the airline's main terminal, a public dedication of a new plaque near the first-class gate. A modest crowd gathered, employees, press, and travelers passing by, unaware they were witnessing a quiet piece of history. The plaque shimmered under the terminal lights. Read, "Equality is not a courtesy, it is a responsibility. Dr. Charles and Mrs. Eleanor Whitmore, ****. Eleanor stepped forward to speak, her voice filling the open space. "When you stand here," she said, "you are at the beginning of a journey, not just for passengers but for the people who serve them. We are all travelers, learning how to treat one another with dignity along the way." She looked around, her gaze steady. "The day a person believes they can tell another where they belong, that is the day they've forgotten we all share the same sky." Applause swelled softly, sincere and lingering. From the crowd, Samantha stood near the back, her heart full. She had been promoted quietly, not for pity but for growth. Now she trained new recruits, teaching them the lesson that had once broken and rebuilt her. When the applause faded, Eleanor saw her and beckoned her forward. Samantha hesitated, then approached the stage. Eleanor gestured toward her. "This young woman," she said, "reminded me that mistakes can be bridges, not walls. It takes courage to face your own reflection, and even greater courage to change it." Samantha's voice trembled as she spoke. "I'll never forget what you both taught me, that true service isn't about status, it's about seeing people. Really seeing them." Eleanor nodded with pride. "Then you've learned the heart of it." The cameras flashed. The crowd applauded again, louder this time, not for celebrity but for humanity. When the event ended, Eleanor and Charles lingered for a while, watching the flow of passengers through the gate, all colors, ages, and backgrounds moving side by side. A few smiled at the plaque as they passed, others paused to read it carefully. Charles looked at his wife. "We've built many things, but this one feels different." She smiled softly. "Because this one isn't built from ambition. It's built from understanding." They walked toward the terminal exit slowly, the sound of rolling suitcases blending with quiet chatter. The world around them seemed lighter somehow, not perfect but more aware. Outside, the evening sun dipped low, painting the runway in soft gold. An airplane roared upward into the sky, engines cutting clean through clouds. Eleanor watched it for a long moment. "You know," she said, "every flight feels like a second chance for someone. A chance to start over, to rise again, to be better." Charles nodded. "And as long as people keep flying, hope keeps moving." They stood there together, two lives woven into the story of progress, while the sky, vast and open, seemed to listen. As they turned to leave, Eleanor said quietly, "We can't control every heart, Charles. But we can light the path for the ones willing to learn." "And that," he replied, "is all the justice we ever needed." The wind picked up gently, tugging at Eleanor's scarf. She smiled, eyes on the sky one last time before they walked toward their car, side by side. The world behind them buzzed with movement and noise, but their calm presence lingered like a reminder that dignity, once awakened, never truly fades. What would you do in this moment? Would you walk away, or would you help someone rise higher than before? Comment below if you believe respect is the greatest form of justice. Hit subscribe if you believe the world changes when we choose grace over pride, and when we remember that no one, anywhere belongs behind anyone else.